My guest at this time is Andrew C. McCarthy, a former federal prosecutor. He is now a contributing editor and columnist for National Review Online. He's also a Fox News contributor. He has joined us many times throughout this entire investigation by Special Counsel Robert Mueller and in looking at other aspects of the investigation into the 2016 campaign. We now know, at least from a letter from the Attorney General of the United States, Bill Barr, that Mueller found no evidence that Trump or anyone else in the campaign conspired or colluded with Russians to influence the outcome. He also says there's not enough evidence to go forward on obstruction of justice. From what we know, Mueller says there's kind of evidence on both sides of that and didn't feel like he could reach a conclusion. So, Andy, over the times that you and I went through this, you kind of thought this is where this was all headed. What's the big takeaway for you on all this?
Well, I think the most interesting thing, Greg, is that really Mueller was derelict in not drawing a conclusion on the obstruction aspect of the investigation. I think the collusion, as far as that all goes, I think it was probably clear to Mueller within a couple of months of his investigation, surely by the end of 2017, that there was no collusion case. And this investigation, as far as Mueller was concerned, was really instigated by an allegation of obstruction. In fact, he was named hot on the heels, we now know, of Andrew McCabe, then the acting director of the FBI right after Comey got fired, opening an obstruction investigation of the president based on mainly on the firing of James Comey. I think we've talked about that. I think that was an invalid theory, but the point is this really was presented as an obstruction investigation when Mueller took it on. The collusion has always been sort of the elastic mood music of the whole thing, but obstruction seemed to be what they were really going after. And it's amazing to me that a guy could spend 22 months with the kind of staff he had, a bottomless budget, all kinds of legal talent, and then he gets to the end and he tells us, well, I'm not going to make a traditional prosecutorial finding. I'm just going to tell you what the facts are on both sides, and you fellas decide whether there's a crime here or not. It makes me think, like, what the hell did we need you for?
Yeah, that is kind of his job, is to determine if there's a...
That was his only job. Really, I mean, if you think about it, his only job was to do what he refrained from doing, which is to draw a traditional or prosecutorial conclusion about whether there's enough evidence to indict or not. And for him to do what he did, which is to come out and say, I'm neither going to accuse nor exonerate President Trump, was just throwing Trump's detractors a bone. Prosecutors never exonerate anyone. What prosecutors do is they make a decision about whether to charge or to decline to charge based on whether there's enough evidence and whether a case meets, in this case, Justice Department standards. Whether that ends up exonerating somebody or not is for the commentariat and, you know, windbags like us out here to decide. It's not what prosecutors do. In fact, prosecutors don't even usually close a case publicly, because we all know that even if you close a case, there's nothing magic or formal about that, in the sense that if new evidence popped out of the sky tomorrow, you couldn't reopen it and charge it. So usually you quietly go about your business and you either charge or you don't charge, but you don't announce that you're exonerating someone. You didn't hear Mueller say, I hereby exonerate President Trump on the collusion aspect of the investigation. He only said that with respect to obstruction, but what he didn't say was the one thing he was hired to say, which is, was there a crime or not?
So when you're not supposed to publicly exonerate people, he's a tad Comey-esque in that department, then, it sounds like.
Well, I think what happened here is importantly different from the Comey situation. I think here we have a situation where for 22 months, I believe they investigated on the basis of an invalid theory of obstruction, this idea that you could cite a president for obstruction not on the basis of corrupt acts that would tamper with evidence or witnesses, but on the basis of lawful exercises of the president's constitutional prerogatives if a second-guessing inferior executive officer, the prosecutor, decided that they may have been undertaken with an improper motive. I think that was an untenable legal theory, and it was an impractical factual theory. You couldn't operate the Justice Department on, forget about the damage it would do to the presidency. Imagine if you're a supervisor in the Justice Department and you can be indicted for obstruction if you make a personnel decision to remove a prosecutor from one investigation and put him on another, and then somebody comes around later and decides, well, maybe that was corrupt. Maybe you were trying to affect the investigation. You couldn't operate that way. So I don't think it was a valid legal theory, and I think that the staff that Mueller brought on board, many of whom were very partisan Democrats, they're undoubtedly very skilled prosecutors, but they had an unusual zeal about going after Trump. They were invested in this novel theory of prosecuting obstruction. And when President Trump nominated Bill Barr, and we learned of his memo that he wrote as a concerned former Attorney General to the Justice Department, attacking Mueller's theory of obstruction, at least the one that had been reported and the one I believe Mueller was following, the handwriting was on the wall that obstruction theory that Mueller was pursuing was not going to fly if Barr was Attorney General. And so you had Mueller in between, I think, his staff, which wanted to push this novel theory of obstruction. I don't think he was – I think he couldn't tell them no. They were very invested in this investigation, the way that they had done it. And at the same time, he didn't feel strongly enough about its rectitude to say, yeah, we're going to take on Barr. We're going to say that this is the way that you prove obstruction, and let Attorney General Barr try to tell us that he's not going to approve the potential of charges based on that theory. He didn't want to do either of those things. He didn't want to decide. So what he did was he said, here's the facts, Attorney General, you decide. And, I know a lot of people are saluting Mueller today. I think there are a lot of – I'm not one of these Mueller bashers. I'm not ever going to be someone who says that he's unscrupulous or that he's a dirty cop or any of that nonsense that I hear all the time. But there were a lot of improprieties in this investigation. There were a lot of improprieties, I think, that went on after he took it over. And the one thing he was hired to do, basically, was make a decision about whether there was enough investigation to charge the president with obstruction, and he punted.
We're talking with Andrew C. McCarthy, former federal prosecutor, Fox News contributor, contributing editor at National Review Online, where he's also a columnist, and his columns have been pretty much right on the money throughout this investigation. Andy, a lot to get to in our last few minutes here. Let's talk about the fallout now in a couple different ways. First of all, on the left, you've got folks saying, well, this is just the beginning here. We got to get the full report. And if Barr doesn't give the full report, then he's protecting Trump in some way. We've got the Southern District of New York. We've got these congressional committees, particularly on the House side, with the Democrats in control. And so this is really just getting ramped up. What do you make of that?
Well, I think, the very fact, Greg, that we've talked about collusion for so long is indicative of the political nature of this investigation from the beginning. I mean, prosecutors don't care about collusion, right? Collusion is just concerted activity. They care about conspiracy. But this term collusion was adopted because it's politically useful. It was elastic enough to cover any kind of association or concerted activity between Trump people and people connected to the Kremlin, regardless of whether it was criminal or not, regardless of whether it came close to being a violation of federal law or not. So I think the political nature of this investigation, maybe it was unavoidable, but it's been fraught from the beginning. And there's no reason to think that just because Mueller has finished, that the Democrats were ever going to take Mueller as the last word, because they defined collusion in a way that was much more expansive than anything that would be a federal crime. They can certainly contend that it's Congress's right, which it is, to look at connections between the Trump campaign and the president himself and Russia. If they want to do that, they're certainly entitled. Elections have consequences. We knew that if the Democrats won the election and they got subpoena power in the House, this was exactly the sort of thing they were going to do. So it's no surprise to see them do it. My only thing is, if we're going to have disclosure, we ought to have full disclosure, which means not only Mueller's version of events in his report should come out, which is the prosecutor's version of events, but in a normal trial, the defendant gets discovery not only of the prosecutor's evidence, but all of the underlying investigative tactics and all of the underlying investigative materials and files, like, the representations that you make to a court to get warrants and how the investigation started. All that stuff gets given to the defense. And when the prosecutor publicly puts his case in, the defense is given the opportunity to put the government on trial and say, no, they tried to railroad this guy. Look at the way that they investigated this. Look at the tactics they used. And then the jury gets to decide it. So I think, if Mueller's report's going to get out there, that's fine by me. I think the more disclosure, the better. But put it all out there. Let's see the FISA applications. Let's see the memoranda that explain how and why and when this investigation was opened, the decision making that was done, why it is that the FBI director was telling the president that the Steele dossier was unverified, and yet the FBI, at the very same time he was doing that, was filing with the FISA court something that was called a verified application that was based on the Steele dossier in order to get FISA warrants. So I think all of that ought to be explored, and we ought to get sunshine over all of it.
Andy, last topic, and if you want to get more detail from Andy on what he thinks ought to be done from the quote-unquote defense side of this, an excellent column on National Review Online I encourage folks to read. One of the other folks that's become a player in all of this, particularly in cable news, not so much in the legal aspects or the Mueller investigation itself, but Michael Avenatti, former attorney for the adult film performer Stormy Daniels. He also inserted himself into the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation process. He's being charged with federal crimes on two different coasts, one in New York for trying to extort Nike for about $20 million, and then out in Los Angeles where he's had a legal presence as well. He's facing federal charges for effectively stealing the damages due to his clients, claiming he never got them, and then using them to pay off various debts of his. So how do you put I don't know if we're at the postmortem for the public life of Michael Avenatti, but where do you stand on him? What do you think the takeaway is there?
Greg, now you're going to make me get out my why do bad things happen to good people file. Look, this Avenatti has clearly been in his, the 15 minutes of fame that he got out of this, a guy who, enjoys living on the razor's edge. And I think he's now attracted the attention of the Justice Department. Having worked in the Southern District of New York for 20 years, I can tell you that, if they have indicted him on a big fraud case, he better pack his lunch bucket because he's in for a long day. These guys are very good at what they do in terms of investigations. To pull the trigger on a case like this against somebody who's made himself into, for better or worse, into a public figure, I don't think that they'd have indicted a case like this unless it was pretty serious business. So, I hope he's as good of a lawyer as he thinks he is.
Exit question, focusing on my business. The media, we're probably not done with all the allegations against Trump here because of, like we said before, the Democratic majority in the House, and who knows what's happening at the Southern District of New York. But based on what the media regularly told us was probably coming, in this investigation, and now we know that it hasn't, what's the reaction on the media's performance over the past 2+ years?
Well, the media's performance has been awful, but I think in the same way that you feel if you've been doing what I've been doing for the last couple of years, and you feel a little bit justified of having looked at this carefully and and taken the measure of what they probably had, so that you're not all that surprised when the bottom line comes out and it turns out they don't have a case. I think the same thing is true of, analyzing the media's performance here. There's a reason why a number of us have taken to calling it a media Democrat enterprise, where it's unclear where one ends and the other one begins. They've become so politicized that I just think it's really unfortunate, not only for themselves but for the country, that you get the impression that you just can't get straight news anyplace. And I think we're learning, not very well maybe, but we're learning to live with the idea that, there are alternative sources of news, and, you have to listen to their news and your news and try to figure out when it clashes what the truth is and all that stuff. But it's really terrible that there isn't a mainstream media that's committed to just telling us what happened without having to spin everything, and without having a situation where you can't even tell anymore what the difference is between straight news reporting and opinion journalism. There used to be a bright line between those things, and there's not anymore. It's like everybody's got an axe to grind, and it's really terrible for the country.
Andy, it's been a busy day for you, I know. Thanks for making time for us. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Greg.
Andrew C. McCarthy, former federal prosecutor, contributing editor at National Review Online, where he's also a columnist. He's also a Fox News contributor. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.